Thank you all for attending this evening, for signing on and joining in on this conversation. And thank you so much to the Historical Society Press and Foundation for hosting this event, and for providing the opportunity to visit a little bit more about a woman whose story continues to intrigue me. I accidentally actually stumbled upon the story of Mabel Rewman when Molly and Lori had put out a call for their anthology. I was reading up on the story of women's suffrage in South Dakota, and I stumbled upon a name, Mabel Rewman, who was said to be from Deadwood. I was really wanting to tell the story of women's suffrage in the Black Hills, and so I wanted to dig in further and learn more about her. And this is a story that has continued to grow since this was initially published in 2019. And her story keeps pulling me back as we learn so much more about her, and her life kind of connects with some of the larger questions historians are asking about the suffrage movement. And the impacts it had on women's lives. And so we're going to kind of take a deeper look at Mabel's story, her background, how she got involved in suffrage, her work specifically in South Dakota and in the Black Hills, and then actually kind of take a little bit of a look into how that became a launching pad for her, and what she did after women had the right to vote. And so we're going to go back to the spring of 1918 to kind of kick off our story. By the spring of 1918, Mabel Rewman, when you read about her, sounds absolutely inexhaustible. But I found a letter from her, dated that spring, that makes mention that maybe this woman who had done so much, by this time, she was a member of the Round Table Club of Deadwood, a local Red Cross worker, the head of Deadwood's Women's Committee for the Council of National Defense, a member of the Women's Auxiliary of the Deadwood Businessmen's Club, and the finance chair for the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, may have confessed to being a little bit tired. Weeks on the road raising funds for the 1918 women's suffrage campaign had resulted in numerous successes that had been reported in newspapers, and in suffrage correspondence, and there had been significant donations to the cause. However, her husband's office assistant back in Deadwood had left while she was traveling, and she felt she needed to stay around the Black Hills to help assist her husband in the interim. Her extended absences traveling for the cause of suffrage had also led to some mutterings from her fellow Red Cross volunteers. Maybe she was prioritizing her suffrage work more than her commitment to the Red Cross. And so in this letter, she is writing to inform Amy Shields Pyle, the president of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, that she is going to have to delay her statewide fundraising tour, and stay in the Black Hills for a little while. However, she ends on this really lovely note that even in her small corner of the state in the suffrage campaign, there was much work to be done, and so she would press on. And I love starting with that correspondence because it really kind of demonstrates so much of Mabel Rewman, and the breadth and depth of her work, and her life. And so if we kind of pull back even further in her story, yes, she was an indomitable force fighting for women's suffrage in the Black Hills throughout the 1910s. But how does she get involved in this campaign? She was actually born in Illinois in 1875, and moved around quite a bit throughout her childhood. She grew up in Kansas. She ended up working in a wide variety of businesses, real estate, loans, insurance, moving again throughout Missouri, Illinois, even owning her own grocery business in Oklahoma. She had actually been out in Washington State caring for an ill sister when she herself needed to visit a doctor for an ulcer. And her specialist was a female, who encouraged her to get involved with a worthy cause, right? Kind of take something, get some outside of her caretaking duties, kind of do something for herself. And since the doctor was a suffragist, she encouraged Rewman to also get involved with the Washington State Equal Suffrage Association and join the suffrage cause for herself. Rewman, in true fashion, not only joined, but then became the secretary for the state headquarters, as you can see on this image on the screen, working with Emma Smith DeVoe, who had actually lived in Huron and had been a leader of the South Dakota suffrage movement in the 1880s to 1890s. And she worked very closely with Emma Smith DeVoe throughout this Washington campaign. She then, during this time, also met Mr. Paul Rewman and moved to Deadwood as he ran the Black Hills Telephone Exchange Company in Deadwood, and they moved in 1912. And I have to say, this move to Deadwood would be momentous. Not only for Rewman and for the women's suffrage movement in the community, but really for kind of the state of South Dakota as a whole, as we'll see as the story continues. Rewman immediately became involved in numerous community organizations, taking on leadership roles within Deadwood and the state. By 1914, she became active in the state suffrage movement. She campaigned before the state legislature in 1915. Hosted her friend and colleague Emma Smith DeVoe in 1916 as part of their flying squadron tour throughout the state, and then served as the state delegate to the National American Woman Suffrage Association's National Convention. She was chair of the Lawrence County Suffrage Campaign in 1917, and then put in charge of finance for the state organization in 1918. And the state finance chair position is a really interesting, I would say, addition to her resume here. Mamie Shields Pyle, the president of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, specifically sought out Mabel Rewman for this position. Rewman herself was very unsure of whether she was qualified to take on this task. Pyle had warned her that it would take extensive travel, that the organization required at least $30,000 for the 1918 campaign, that the wheels of the campaign simply wouldn't turn without this amount of fundraising. And they knew this by experience. There had been history in South Dakota suffrage campaigns having issues fundraising, being able to pay people to go out on the road and tour for the campaign. And so, Rewman knew she had quite the task before her and had made her rather nervous. But Pyle was determined that Rewman was the woman for the job, and eventually convinced Mabel to sign on and take on this task. And so, while doubtful of her own ability, as soon as she said yes, Pyle sent her letters with very specific instructions about beginning to plan her campaigns and fundraising travels throughout the hills, out into Pierre, and then East River into Huron, Sioux Falls, Yankton, and other major communities throughout the state. To get herself started, she decided to kind of start at home in the Black Hills in early 1918, where she was kind of more confident, where she felt like she had more connections. And so she very quickly went to the newspapers throughout the Black Hills to gain their support for the women's suffrage cause and to begin encouraging people through articles and interviews in the newspapers to begin to raise funds for the 1918 suffrage campaign. And the Deadwood Pioneer Times came out in support of Rewman and the amendment, stating that they expected Rewman to accomplish a lot through this role. And so she has some early victories in gaining some support and some fundraising. Throughout then the next couple months, she continues to focus on the Black Hills region, really trying to get these communities involved and supportive of the campaign. One of her goals is to get the college students involved, and so she writes to Mamie Shields Pyle about a big event at the Normal in Spearfish, with over 350 pupils in attendance as she spoke. And so this travel for the cause of suffrage also gave her an opportunity to really enhance her speaking skills, and she became quite the campaigner as she continued her tour. It was not until March when we begin to see kind of her need for a break. She had spent a week in Pier, and while she was incredibly proud of all that they accomplished, saying that their time in Pier had been a victory, she had needed to come home and stay home for a little while, again, checking in on all of her other community activities, her Red Cross work, assisting her husband in his office before she could go back out on the road. As we all know, that weather in South Dakota can make travel in the spring a little exciting. And so there are significant weather delays in March and early April. Sounds like a little bit of that first spring, second winter setting in. And so her travels are delayed until April, when she's able to begin her kind of major fundraising tour. And she'll be out on tour throughout spring and early summer, traveling throughout the state. This is when we see her going from town to town. She is committed to staying in each community until she has raised what she has deemed her fundraising quota. She is successful enough in the events she's planning and in coordinating with the organizations within each community that she will have hit her fundraising quotas within days. And so organizations are hearing of the success she's having in raising funds. And there is a flurry of letters to Pyle and the offices of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, where suffrage organizations are asking Rewman to come, offering to host her, to throw an event, put on an event while she is there so she can speak and continue to raise money successfully for the cause. One of the things that Rewman was very concerned about was to ensure that she would not be doing a fundraising tour in a community at the same time that that community would be having a war fund drive. And so as she was creating her tour schedule and working very closely with the state offices, communities had to be very clear that when they were hosting Rewman, that suffrage would be their only focus, that kind of war bond drives or war fund drives were not actively going on at that time. She wanted to make sure that it didn't look like people were choosing, one over the other, but that the women's suffrage movement at the time was also supporting the fundraising campaigns for World War I. So I thought that was kind of an interesting additional logistical challenge for Rewman as she's traveling around. Despite all of these travels, she is able to get back to the Black Hills in June because she is hosting what were known as suffrage schools. These were run by leaders from the National American Woman Suffrage Association. These schools focused on kind of campaign tactics, methods of success, organizing strategies, public relations tips and hints for those who were involved in these campaigns. Mabel had been very nervous about bringing these leaders to Deadwood and kind of leading a Northern Hills suffrage school, but she later reported that this event was a howling success. So in addition to traveling the state, trying to raise money for this campaign, she also hosted gatherings and key suffrage speakers. She traveled extensively to give speeches. She campaigned in front of the state legislature, and again, attended the National Women's Suffrage Convention in Washington, D.C. When influenza hit the Black Hills communities, Rewman tried to lend a hand to other organizations, diverting money, for example, to the Lead Suffrage Organization so that they could continue to print their campaign materials and distribute them. Personally traveling all throughout the hills to distribute flyers and posters when others were too ill or too busy caring for others and were not able to do so. And so we can see just kind of the level of commitment she had to the 1918 campaign and the role that she played in helping that campaign become the success that it was. And I don't think anyone would blame her if she had wanted to stop in 1918 and take a deep breath and rest for a little while after that very successful and busy push. And instead, she really takes the skill sets and the networks she developed during her time on the suffrage campaign trail and immediately jumped into her next work. And so she continues to take on leadership roles. She started a PEO chapter in Deadwood. Joined the South Dakota League of Women Voters, and then joined their campaign to have women serve on juries. Due to her, work on all of these different campaigns, she was recognized by Governor Norbeck, who placed her on the Women's Board of Investigation in 1918, and then appointed her again to the Board of Charities and Corrections in 1920, making her the first woman to hold a position on one of the constitutional boards of the state. She then kind of moved from state positions of leadership to national positions. She, as I mentioned, had really honed her speaking skills. And so she actually became a national campaigner for candidates on the national level, campaigning throughout the country for different presidential candidates, and then became a national committee woman for the Republican Party for decades. And her service there was recognized early on in 1929. President Hoover actually appointed her to the Board of Labor Review, advising the Secretary of Labor in Washington, D.C. And that was a position she would hold for years, as you can see the kind of announcement on the screen. And so again, kind of taking all of what she had learned and developed in those years fighting for suffrage, and really turning this into a launching pad for a national political career, staying active in national politics for decades. For our story, though, and particularly for this historian, perhaps one of the greatest services that Mabel rendered is her role in writing down the suffrage history of South Dakota. In the early 1950s, she secured the assistance of historian Herbert S. Schell at the University of South Dakota. He promised Rewman, who was then living in Vermilion as the wife of Guy Frary, that he would endeavor to find someone in the graduate school who would write the South Dakota woman suffrage story. And in 1958, Dorinda Reeson-Reed wrote a master's thesis on the subject. Reed interviewed Rewman and Frary, and the former suffragist played a key role in kind of guiding Reed to photographs, papers, connecting her with others who had been involved in the suffrage movement in South Dakota, really kind of allowing Reed to tell a very personal story. So the preface to the Reed's text is here on the screen. And again, here's a suffragist who not only dedicated years of her life to gain access to the ballot, she then, used that access to the ballot to continue her political career, and then ensured that history had a record of the South Dakota suffrage movement. And if you haven't read Dorinda Reeson-Reed's work on suffrage history, I highly recommend it. And with that, I can pass it over to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Kelly Kirk. And if you have questions that you want to make sure you don't forget, you could type them real quick in the chat. I know someone just did that. And then I'm going to turn things over to Kelly O'Day. So onward.
Make sure that
Yeah, it's working.
Technology correctly.
There we go.
All righty. First, I just want to say thank you to the South Dakota Historical Society Press and Foundation for this awesome event. It's great to speak with Kelly Kirk again. I also have a few significant women in my life that I want to acknowledge before I get started. Um, the first two are going to be Molly Rosem and Lori Ann Lallam. I was approached to do this project as a humble grad student, and this was really kind of a significant jumping off point of what I could potentially do with my degree. Um, Secondly, I have to acknowledge Dr. Carol Leibiger, who is a librarian at the ID Weeks Library at USD. She is a phenomenal woman who helped refine my German translations. So it's difficult to put your work out there in the first place, and it's extra difficult when it's not your first language. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge my mother, Deb Pearson. She hauled me into ID Weeks Library when I was in the 5th grade and showed me how awesome it is to do newspaper research on a microfiche machine. So is a love that I have continued to today. So without further ado, I will get started here. So there was a significant German-speaking population in Dakota Territory, largely due to the numbers of German immigrants from Western Europe and Russia. These communities were able to support some 64 German publications, but today we're just going to focus on 2 of those newspapers, the Dakota Freie Presse and the Deutscher Herald. In 1916, the Women's Anti-Suffrage Association of South Dakota sponsored multiple ads in the Deutscher Herald against Amendment Number 6, which would have enfranchised South Dakota's women. And there are after several attempts to gain the vote for women in South Dakota, it's not until the passage of Amendment E in 1918 that our women finally gained that right to vote. So many suffragists in the state believed the lack of support of German immigrants significantly impacted their chance at an earlier victory. And by looking at German language newspapers, we can gain some insight into the attitudes of South Dakota's German speaking folks and how their votes affected women's suffrage amendments, which I think would suggest why women's enfranchisement lacked support in many German-speaking communities. So with the huge role internet plays in our daily lives, it's difficult to imagine the importance of newspapers decades ago. But many immigrants relied on these sources to provide instruction in history, ideals, and procedures of the new country that they were moving to. The Dakota Freie Presse was referred to as the Bible of the Russian Germans by politicians, and it was one of the longest running newspapers in the country. Originally based in Yankton, the newspaper relocated to Aberdeen. And then we have the Deutscher Herald, which was based in Sioux Falls and ceased publication in 1918. And then shortly after the 1918 election, the Dakota Freie Presse relocates to Minnesota. So in some cases, the newspapers simply translated English language articles, but a majority of the content came from the editors, featuring items from German reporters and German community members. Both of these newspapers provided regional, national, and international news, while particularly prioritizing international news from Germany and Russia. Ads for land sales were often alongside lengthy political articles. After its relocation to Aberdeen, the Dakota Freie Presse takes on more of a Republican tone. And then the Deutscher Herald more often espouses Democratic viewpoints in their political articles. And although these two German newspapers, essentially German language newspapers, end up being kind of rival publications, neither one of them supported women's suffrage in Dakota Territory, South Dakota. I'm going to just show you this ad a little bit here, and then we will talk about it. Although national and some state suffragists attempted to divorce themselves from the temperance reform, content on both issues often appeared side by side in German language newspapers. The Deutscher Herald placed this ad on the screen directly next to a page-length ad about voting no on Amendment 7, which was the Prohibition Amendment. The anti-prohibition ad did not reference suffragists, and the only reference to women was part of a pro-prohibition amendment argument that the ad aimed to discredit. In October 1916, the Dakota Freie Presse also published an almost identical prohibition ad. And I would have included that on the slideshow, but if you think about how long a newspaper is, the ad wouldn't have been readable. All right, so there was one especially interesting editorial from Fred Barth. He was a resident of Olivet, South Dakota, and claimed he was not an enemy of the female sex, but had respect and honor for women. Barth explained that he did not support women's suffrage because he didn't believe that a single woman would use it. He had already spoken with many women about women's suffrage, and these women said they already had enough to do at home. They, quote, want to nurture their children in the position that God has instructed them, end quote. However, the opening of Barth's letter also references the inconvenience that Amendment number 7 on prohibition would pose for traveling farmers who visited pubs and saloons on their way home. He said that the community had previously had little criminal activity, which was apparently a justification that an amendment on prohibition was unnecessary. So we are going to do this. I should have given you an opportunity to read this earlier. So to the voters of South Dakota, wherever women's suffrage was introduced in this country, a tax increase has followed. So there's a concern, of course, with higher taxes, which is a common concern in our history, and also this kind of coercive action towards voting. And I think many of us know today, even if you are registered to vote, that doesn't mean you actually have to do that. So in the months leading up to the fourth vote on women's suffrage in 1914, the Deutscher Herald included a short blurb in their politics section that asked if women's influence would make a political campaign more decent. And the author of this blurb determined that not in the least, quote, after all, the editor of the state organ of women's suffragists in South Dakota has already insulted the Germans because of their negative attitude on this issue, end quote. So it's possible that this political blurb is a response to an editorial in the South Dakota Messenger, which is the Universal Franchise League's official paper. And according to scholar Patricia O'Keefe Easton, Ruth B. Hipple wrote critically about German and German-Russian men who, quote, could not be expected to be in favor of equal suffrage when they allowed their own women to take week-old babies out into the field while they worked, end quote. So as the 1914 election draws closer, arguments against women's suffrage continue in the politics section of both newspapers. The Deutscher Herald also published a translated article from the Deadwood Pioneer Times. which is on your screen. This is the end clip of the article. The answers of a woman from Deadwood on the arguments of women's suffragists. The 22nd of October, 1914 issue listed 10 claims from pro-suffragist advocates, to which a woman identified only as DH responded to each individual claim. The first was advocates of women's suffrage claim the right to vote is inherent or innate. And DH responded, in truth, quote, in truth, it is a duty, not a privilege. The compulsion or the duty to exercise the right to vote is often a burden that most women would shrink from, end quote. The numbered list concluded with a claim on the educational and meaningful value of the right to vote. In opposition to this, DH responded, quote, for some women who have no plans for anything else, it may seem like a duty to mix themselves in politics. But for God-fearing, faithful, and natural mother, politics has no appeal. With more such old-fashioned German mothers, the world will become even purer and better, end quote. So I found this particularly interesting because this is published after Barth's editorial, and some of DH's responses to these claims seem to mirror his opinions also. With the approach of the, excuse me, the 1916 election, the Dakota Freie Presse and the Deutscher Herald included explanatory articles on all of the ballot measures. In the Dakota Freie Presse, for measure number 6 on women's suffrage, editor John Schrader's article said, quote, number 6 is a measure of the prohibitionists who hope to suppress the personal freedom with the help of the women. Make a thick cross before the word no, end quote. Schrader used the German word Weiber, meaning female, instead of Frauen, meaning women, which is what made this particular article interesting because it casts a subtle derogatory meaning, suggesting that real German women are not looking to gain suffrage rights at this time. It's only the less respectable dames that are going out and campaigning. With the conclusion of the 1916 election came a significant decline in news coverage about women's suffrage in these newspapers. A majority of the articles after the November election only reported election results. In November, the 1916, the Deutscher Herald published the official voting results for the state, which showed a majority of South Dakotans had voted against the women's suffrage amendment with a margin of less than 5,000 votes. The Dakota Freie Presse, the Dakota Freie Presse included national results of the presidential election, but didn't say anything about Amendment 6 or 7. Both newspapers published several articles on women's suffrage prior to 1916, but in 1918, both newspapers were silent on the issue. The Dakota Freie Presse published its weekly edition on Election Day, but mentioned nothing about women's suffrage. Throughout 1918, the Dakota Freie Presse only made a couple references to women's suffrage, and that was in the context of President Wilson's appeal to Congress for a federal amendment in favor of women's suffrage. Majority of the arguments against women's suffrage revolved around the preservation of the German mother and her duties to the family. In addition, the association between anti-prohibition and anti-suffrage sentiments seemed to be strongly correlated, especially after the passage of the state's prohibition amendment in 1916, which, as I mentioned, we see a very sharp decline in news coverage at this point. World War I also proves to be a significant topic in news coverage. And after relocation to Aberdeen, the Dakota Free Press almost exclusively dedicates its front page to news of the war. Oh, yep, I guess that was it. All right. Back to you, Deidre.
Thank you both, Kellys, for fantastic and fascinating presentations. And